So this next story goes out to all of my Oregon peeps, especially you, Ray. This story is about a lost cabin of gold, and this story is from the archives, and the article written about this is by Finn J.D. John. So this story starts out in Jacksonville, Oregon, in southern Oregon. So Jacksonville, Oregon had been founded on the Rich Gulch strike in 1851. But Rich Gulch, though worthy of its name, had been pretty shallow, and by 1853, the time that brothers James and Henry Wilson arrived, things were already petering out. For the time being, most of the miners were just trying to get around the edges of what had already been dug, and they weren't finding much. So James and Henry had no interest in toiling in the dirt all day for a few dollars. They decided to strike it out into the wilderness and try to find another Rich Gulch. Problem was, in 1853, the rogue Indians considered trespassing on their lands an act of war. So prospecting was absolutely unsafe, and there had been a party wiped out near Table Rock north of town. Most folks in Jacksonville were keen on staying not too far outside the city limits until things had settled down a bit. James and Henry didn't really care. So they were able to assemble a small team of miners who felt the same way. So when they headed out to do their prospecting, they had some safety in numbers. But as it turned out, not quite enough. They soon ran into a war party, which of course promptly attacked. They fended it off, but one of the miners was killed. After that, the miners called a council and voted to head back to Jacksonville and wait for the war to end. Henry and James, though, decided to take their chances alone. They waved goodbye to their comrades and struck out into the mountains. This parting of ways happened beside a mineral spring at the base of a tall rock formation that looked like an hourglass. So, noting this rock as a landmark to remember their path by, the brothers set out for a range of mountains visible in the distance, probably the Siskiyous. Once these mountains, or rather higher foothills of them, once there, the brothers stumbled across a narrow valley walled in on both sides by steep, rugged cliffs, with a little creek running through it. The valley's defensive potential was obvious. So it had some nice little meadows for the horses to graze on too. So the boys decided to let the animals rest for a few days, and they built a little log cabin there. Doubtless they planned to stay for a little while and use it as a hub for their next round of prospecting expeditions. The next day, though, while drinking from the little creek, Henry discovered that it was loaded with gold. Scooping up a handful of gravel, he found that it was literally peppered with nuggets. They wouldn't need a gold pan to work these diggings, he realized. They could just wade in the creek and pick the nuggets out with their fingers. Well, it's not hard to imagine what the brothers spent the rest of the day doing, or the next day either. Soon they had a large pile of gold heaped up on the floor of their little cabin. Well, that was pleasant. They were rich. Now the challenge was living long enough to enjoy it. The brothers were very nervous about the Indians. They knew the Indian agents and the army were doing what they could to settle things down, but they also knew that pacifying the rogues would take a while. While they figured they were fairly safe in their secret hidden valley, they didn't have enough supplies to spend the winter here. If a ceasefire hadn't been negotiated or forcibly imposed on the tribes by the end of the summer, they'd have to take their chances, and journey home would be very risky. And it's a lot harder to run for your life if it comes to that, if you're carrying hundreds of pounds in gold in your saddlebags. So as the leaves of the trees started to turn colors, signaling the approach of the fall, the boys dug a large hole in the middle of their log cabin floor and lined it with close-fitting rocks. They wrapped up their gold in raw, untanned deer skins and basically filled up the vault with it. They covered the vault with a couple of large flat rocks so that it'd be easier to probe for. They pushed the dirt back over it and started getting ready for the trip back to town. Soon they were on their way, Henry in front, James bringing up the rear, each leading 2 horses. They didn't get far. They weren't even out of sight of the cabin when a volley of shots rang out, and Henry dropped in his tracks. The horses reared and screamed, and a band of Shasta Indians burst into the clearing. James promptly shot one of them with his black powder rifle and dropped it, and pulled out his Colt Navy revolver. The Indians, seeing this and then realizing that they were charging a still armed foe with empty rifles, turned and scrambled back to cover. James took advantage of the break to leap onto the remaining unwounded horse and take off, past Henry's still obviously dead body, galloping for the mouth of the valley and for home. So this trip was a hard one, as James had very few supplies and was armed with only a revolver. By the time he finally stumbled back into a settlement in Northern California, he was in a terrible state of health. He took a stagecoach trip to San Francisco for medical treatment, but nothing seemed to help. Perhaps sensing the end, he started writing letters to his cousin Ted Harper in Chicago, telling him the whole story of the cabin and the Indians and the death of his brother. As soon as he got well, he wrote, he would be going back to getting his gold. But if he didn't make it, he wanted Ted to know where it was. But he hadn't quite gotten around to telling Ted exactly how to reach the cabin when in the fall of 1859, death came for him. Ted Harper, when he was notified of James Wilson's death, headed west to settle his cousin's affairs. When he arrived, he found that James had apparently been in the act of writing a final letter, with detailed directions to reach the cabin at the very moment death had reached out to his bony hand to claim him. The letter he was penning goes as such. Dear cousin, I hope to see you before this, but the end has come sooner than I expected. I think it is nearly over. I must write what I intended to have spoken, and endeavor to give you such directions as will enable you to find the cabin, for you must find it. The first part of your course is plain enough. Start from Jacksonville and keep the California road for... And at that precise point, as seems to be the case with many treasure stories, the text broke off with a smudge of ink and the writer had collapsed onto the page. The next chapter of the story would not take place until about 15 years later, when Cousin Ted enlisted the help of one of Oregon's most famous pioneer poets to help him find the cabin and retrieve the treasure. Samuel L. Simpson was just another fresh-faced lawyer, just out of Willamette University Law School. He had moved to Portland to open his practice, and now he was sitting at his desk at his brand-new office in Portland, sipping a glass of rye and waiting for his first client to walk in the door. No one did. There were just too many lawyers in Portland in 1868. Fresh out of law school with no social connections, Sam didn't have a chance. But finally the door did open and someone stepped inside. It wasn't a client, though. It was one of the other residents in the boarding house he was staying in, a greenhorn from Chicago named Ted Harper. And Harper had a proposition. He wanted Sam to close up his law office and come to Southern Oregon with him. They would spend the summer hunting for a certain ruined cabin with an immense hoard of gold buried inside of it, deep in the wilderness south of Jacksonville, in a hidden valley boxed in by steep cliffs. The only problem was, Harper didn't know exactly where the valley was, or if it was possible that they'd search all summer and get nothing for their pains. But Harper did have a letter giving partial directions to the cabin, which his cousin, who built the cabin and buried the gold, dropped dead in the middle of writing. So Simpson went ahead and agreed to the scheme. He was brand new in law business and had no clients, very few prospects, a summer in the woods, possible fortune, sure, why not? And the two of them traveled to Jacksonville, and they met almost immediately with encouraging success. They found an old trail cutting off from the California road, lined with tree branches cleared with an axe. Indians would not have bothered, but a big party of prospectors leading half a dozen pack horses certainly would have. In fact, it's probably what led the Indians to them. If a habitually drunk lawyer poet and a grass-green dude from Chicago could spot the trail when it was 15 years old, surely a party of Shasta warriors wouldn't have had a whole lot of trouble following it when it was fresh. Be that as it might, Simpson and Harper now followed the path to its end, where they found, to their surprise and delight, the mineral spring and landmark rock mentioned in Harper's cousin James's letters. They rested their horses there for 2 days and then set out again. This time was not so easy. For weeks the two of them had rode through the wild, rugged foothills seeking that secret valley that they read about in the letters of cousin James, but never finding it. Simpson started experiencing a sort of disorientation as his dreams became indistinguishable from his daytime activities, riding endlessly through a tracking wilderness looking for a ruined cabin with its buried treasure trove. Then one night after they made camp and Harper had fallen asleep exhausted, Simpson writes that he was visited by a ghost of a miner, tall, muscular, bearded, in a gray flannel shirt, with a ghostly Colt Model 1851 strapped to his ghostly side. The miner gazed sorrowfully into his eyes without saying anything. Then Simpson woke up. It had all been a dream, or had it? Because now, when Simpson cast his eyes for the 100th time at the broken-off final letter penned by his partner's cousin, there was new writing on it. Someone had taken a ghostly pencil and drawn what looked like two mountain ridges meeting at right angles with a miner's pick just below. Who had done this? What could it mean? Simpson wrote. Was it the idle and unmeaning tracery of my own unconscious hand, or was it the effort of some superior power to direct us on our search for the lost cabin? In doubt of his own reason, Simpson said nothing to Harper. But 2 days later, when the two of them climbed a peak to survey the surrounding country, he saw the two mountain ridges that the ghost had sketched, and just below where the miner's pick had appeared. Now very excited, Simpson told Harper all about his dream and the ghostly vandalism that had been mysteriously perpetrated upon his cousin's last letter. And the two of them enthusiastically descended from the peak and made a beeline for the spot. On we went in a dream of wonder and future wealth, and nothing impeded our progress now, until at least we entered a narrow valley walled by precipitous mountains and bordered on each side by a beautiful stream, the poet writes. We knew we were on sacred ground, and along the shadowy fringe of the forest, where the fretted waters sang a barbaric tune, we rode silent as specters. So the magnetism drew us on, and not a word was spoken. Near the top of the little valley, the two searchers found the blackened ruins of their personal El Dorado. We turned a projecting angle of the wood, and a square, black object half buried in the tangle of weeds was before us. We had found the lost cabin. Nothing now but an empty pen of scorched and blackened logs. With, he adds, a skeleton inside. Apparently, after killing Henry Wilson and scaring off James, the Indians had dragged Henry's corpse back to the cabin and set it afire. But the logs, cut just a couple months before, were too green to burn. The two stepped past the slumping skeleton and grinning skull into the enclosure and started probing the floor in search for their golden fleece. The floor was hard-packed, and Simpson drove his pick into it again and again. Finally, the point connected with solid rock. It was the vault. At that moment, a shot rang out behind him, and a terrible cry. Ted Harper had accidentally shot himself. He now lay there on the floor next to the bones of Henry Wilson, fresher than his cousin, but every bit as dead. It was all too much for the sensitive, poetic soul Sam Simpson, who promptly fainted. A week later, as told by a stagecoach driver, Sam Simpson was found on the California to Oregon stagecoach route, naked, sun-bronzed, and speaking gibberish. He was sent north to Portland. So, is this story true? In the true spirit of Lost Gold Stories, author Ruby L. Holt has found quite a bit of circumstantial evidence to suggest that this expedition did happen, or at least that Simpson and Harper left together on some sort of prospecting trip in 1868, or at least that Simpson did, maybe. If that is, we stipulate that the existence of both the cabin and James's letters, if we stipulate that they existed, there is no real source other than Simpson's article that he wrote. As Holt confirms, the dates line up. Simpson closed his law office in Portland around April of 1868, and other than the fact that he wrote the famous poem Beautiful Willamette shortly thereafter, he's not on record as doing anything else that summer. But as Holt notes, there are a couple of factors that have to be considered. First, there's the fact that Simpson was a poet and a storyteller. And remember, he didn't write this story until much later. After his failed attempt to get started as a lawyer, he went into journalism, writing for newspapers in Corvallis, Eugene, Salem, Portland, and Astoria. By the time he put the pen to paper to tell this story, the Lost Cabin story, presumably in or just before 1899, since it was published just after his death, his poems and stories of colorful Oregon characters were widely published and admired. And he was just as likely to add a spicy little fictional details to his stories, to make them more colorful. How much of the Lost Cabin story is spicy little fictional details, one wonders? All of it? ? Second, there's the fact that he was an alcoholic. This, as Holt notes, suggests an explanation for why he claims Harper just randomly showed up in his law office to entrust him, a complete stranger, with a very valuable secret. But if the two of them had done some carousing together, it becomes very likely indeed that a story like this would be shared over a pint or two of rye. And if the two of them were party buddies, other things become possible as well. Simpson's description or dissociation while the two of them were riding through the wilderness, for example, in which he's never quite sure if he's awake or dreaming, or the visit from the ghostly miner. Those who believe in ghosts will have no trouble here. Holt writes dryly, but I, for one, wonder how much liquor Harper and Simpson had with them. Plenty, of course. No alcoholic ever leaves home without a generous supply or plans of replenishing it as needed. Chances are pretty good that the two of them spent the whole summer in a drunken stupor just trying not to fall off their horses. They may have found the cabin, or maybe they didn't. At some point, either Harper shot himself by accident, or Simpson shot him, or maybe he fell and hit his head. Who really knew what happened? The only witness was a gibbering madman found frolicking mindlessly around the stagecoach road the following week. In fact, it's even possible that Harper didn't die at all, that he double-crossed Simpson, grabbed all the gold for himself, and disappeared. Maybe what Simpson remembered as a gunshot was the sound of Harper's rifle butt crashing into the base of his skull. Maybe Harper took advantage of Simpson's preoccupation with probing the cabin floor to clobber him, not quite succeeding in killing him, but badly rattling his marbles, and then dug up the gold himself and used Simpson's horse to pack out the gold. We may never know for sure unless somebody finds the cabin. If you like these kind of stories, like and subscribe to my channel.